Welcome back. In this session, we will create an Azure API Management service and explore what it has to offer, including registering APIs, setting up OAuth using Azure Entra ID, previously known as Azure AD, as the entity provider, and then exploring policies and what we would need to do in order to add a policy to validate the token from Azure Entra ID. So let's first look at what Azure API Management offers and what we'll be building and where this service really comes into its own. So what is Azure API Management? Well, in order to understand API Management, we need to understand the challenges we have within an organization or a company that has multiple APIs. So let's draw a picture of what the current landscape might look like. So firstly, you're going to have your consumer who is going to be consuming your apps that on your APIs that you've implemented. So we've got our consumer, and then we've got what we're going to call our providers. With this current picture, we end up with different APIs and different implementations. And so it becomes difficult to do things centrally, like locate the APIs that are available within the organization, secure and protect. We may want to offer a single way of accessing and securing those APIs. Looking at control or governance, we might want to control the flow of those APIs and what endpoints they might go to. We may want to do things like enforce policies. All of this is where Azure API Management can help. So let's take our current picture and now let's slot Azure API Management in the mix. So now we've got this in here. What does API Manager actually provide? Well, it gives us centralized management of the APIs. When we talk APIs, we're really talking about what is our back-end APIs. So the APIs that we are offering as part of kind of the products and things that we might be exposing or wanting to expose to our consumers. And the reason for this is API Manager is like a front-facing API, which offers access to your suite of API services. So when we're talking about API Management, we're talking about storing or at least sort of cataloging within there our backend APIs, and then we can look at offering access to those from the consumer. So it centralizes those APIs. The second thing is control access. Who do you want to allow to access those APIs? And then stepping on from that, we can look at things like policies. So within API Management, within Azure, you can set up different policies so that you can look at how you want to do access, how you want to maybe change some of the response or forward some of those API requests. You've got quite an array of different things you can do within those policies. And all of this ensures your back-end services are not directly exposed and you remain in control. Although you do have to realize that adding those APIs into API Management doesn't stop direct access to those APIs. So you'll need to configure those backend APIs so that they're not directly accessible and can only be accessed via coming from the API Management. So you can do things with IPs and policies and things like that as well. So this is really great if you're the kind of organization who likes to acquire other businesses, because then you can start bringing those businesses into the same management suite that you've currently got with your existing organization. It's also really good if you're a company that just has lots, and maybe you've got spawned lots of different APIs, because you can start doing things with those and bringing them under centralized control. Something else you can do within API Management is you can create what are known as products. So you add your APIs in, and then you can create products which can contain one or multiple of those APIs. And that enables you to basically create containers of different APIs, and then you can centrally control those as products other than the endpoint APIs. So this can be really, really useful if you want to group those APIs logically, and then you can implement controls on those products. So that's given us a little bit of an overview, but really, what is Azure API Management? Well, there are two core elements. So the first one, if we draw on that now, is the control plane. So it's here where you configure the thing, the API management service. And this can be completed through the Azure portal. So that'll be using behind the scenes the REST API, CLI. So you can use Azure CLI to do that. You can also use something like PowerShell, and there are other options as well. So you've got various different ways of kind of talking to the control plane and configuring your Azure API. Now the real fun comes from the next bit, and that's, we're going to call it the gateway. And we can think of this as like a managed gateway. So it's really here where all the fun begins and all the interesting stuff happens. So as a managed gateway, it's here where the client application, so our consumer, will actually call our API. So the API gateway has its own URL. So if we draw this, you can see that we're going to have a call coming from the consumer going to the API gateway. And at this point, policies can be applied to the inbound traffic. You can then forward that request on, and we can draw that over, and that can then go to our sort of providers, known as our sort of back-end APIs. And then with the return response, we can then have that coming back, and that will come back to the API gateway. And then we can look at applying policies on that before we then return that back to the consumer. So it really brings a lot of control. We can have a lot of governance, and we've got that all in one place. So hopefully this gives you a very quick, high-level understanding of API management within Azure and how this service works. What I want to do now is draw up a solution where we'll be looking to build something so we can actually draw it on screen, and you can get an understanding of the concepts and the sort of elements and steps we might need to do in order to build that. And then we can dive into the fun of actually building a solution. So let's do that now. So what are we going to build in this session? Well, obviously we're going to be building an instance of Azure API Gateway, which means we're going to have at least one backend API, and we're going to use a pet store, which is a pre-built sort of API endpoint there in order to do that, just as a demo. We're obviously going to have our consumer, which is going to connect to our management gateway or managed gateway in order to provide the calling, incoming call, and then we're going to have the back-end APIs, and that's going to flow through. So a very straightforward Azure API management setup. The extra element we're going to do here is we're going to call Entra ID. So basically what is known or was known as Azure AD, we're going to have a client set up here so that the first call that's going to happen is a call to the Azure AD or the Entra ID in order to basically obtain a token. So that first call here, we're going to have basically a client secret. So we're going to have a secret being provided, and in return of that, we're then going to have a token being provided. And if I number these, just so that we're very clear on the sort of steps here, so this is going to be the first step. This will then be the second step. The third step here, we're going to then talk to the Azure API Management, but we're going to basically provide our kind of call, it'll be the call plus the token is going to be provided at that point as well. And then once that's provided within the API Manager, all the policies around that, so that will then be policies there will then be validated based on the token. And if that is all good, then the call will then get passed back to the backend API. And as discussed earlier, that will be the pet store. So we're going to have a pet store API here. And then that's going to return back to the consumer. So again, a very, very straightforward API here. So again, this is going to have the forward call on it. And then step 5, that's going to be the response. And then that step 5 response gets provided back to the consumer, which will be step 6. So very, very straightforward. We get our token from Azure Entra ID. We're then going to do our call to Azure API Management with our token. That will get validated, and on the basis that that passes our policy that we implement, we'll then have that call being passed forward to the backend API, the pet store, and the response going back. So fairly straightforward. We're not going to go into the details of creating products as we discussed just a minute ago, but this will give us a very good understanding of how we can add backend APIs, how we can add a kind of client to the Entra ID or Azure ID as we would historically call it, and then how that would then get passed on through API management. So let's now log into Azure Portal, and then we can use the control plane in order to configure, create our Azure API service, and then move forwards with this solution. So we're now logged into Azure Portal. So the first step we're going to do is we're going to create a new resource. We're going to create our API management service. Here we go. So it's this one here, and then we're going to hit create. Here we've then got a few options. So depending on what your subscription is, what resource group. So I've got a demos one here for demo purposes. And then we've got to give the resource a name. So I'm going to call it Luke API Manager. And then we've got an organization name. That's already in use. Let's do one then. There we go. And we'll have the organization name being the same. We then got to provide an email address. So I'll do that now as well. And then we've got a pricing tier. Now there are different tiers here depending on what resilience you need and what you're building. Because this is just a demo, I'm going to put it on consumption. Just so you're aware, when it comes to consumption, there are different pricing tiers, but basically consumption as of right now allows you to have something like 1 million calls free as part of just creating this service. So because there's no redundancy or anything like that, it's just there for sort of test purposes really from our point of view, that's absolutely fine. So then we can hit review and create, and that's now going to go off, and once I hit create, that's now going to go off and actually create our API management service. Now this might take a short while to provision, but as soon as it does, it will then pop up here and notify us that it's ready. So our API management service has now been created. We can hit go to resource, and we can see now that we've got this set up. So we've got our gateway URL here. It tells us our tier, etc. And from here, you've got various menus on the left. So what we've got here, which is really important, are the APIs. So it's here where we'll define or add our backend APIs, as we were talking about in the previous part of this session. We can set up products. We won't be doing that as part of this particular session. You can start setting things up like named values. So when we look at adding certain policies in, instead of hard coding values like tenant IDs and things like that, and API keys, etc., you can have those stored in named values and so forth. So what we want to do first of all here is we want to be able to add an API. So what we've got is Azure has actually got a sort of open API specification for something called Pet Store. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a very quick look at that, and then we'll look at adding that to our API management service. So here we've got the Microsoft Open API specification page here, and on this it shows you the details, and there's a link here for the Pet Store API. So again, this is a really good guide. I'll put it in the description so you can see it here, but it tells you how to import a backend API that's using Open API. So here we've got the Pet Shop API. So if I click this, we can see here that we've got a Swagger endpoint, and there's various things here to update an existing pet, create a new pet at the store, create stores instead of pets, as well as users, deletes, all sorts there. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this API in our solution here. So this will be really, really useful for us to use. So I'm going to click that link again, and then we've got it up here. So I can grab this specification. I can then go back to API Manager, and we can look at adding this in. So let's do that now. So we're now back on API Manager. So from APIs, we can then look at Open API. So we're going to select that now. We can then very simply paste in our pet store Swagger here. And I'm going to put a URL suffix in here. We could just call this pet store actually. So just to be clear what we're doing here, what we're doing is we're taking an endpoint for the backend sort of specification here. So the backend service, as we want to call it. And then what we're able to do is within API Manager, this is our API endpoint, our gateway endpoint, and then we can give it an API suffix. So when you're adding multiple APIs in here, you can have slash whatever, dog store slash whatever. So here we're going to call this pet store. We can then hit create. And what that's done is that's then used the Swagger endpoint in order to create all of the operations around this store. So what we can do now is we can actually test one of these. So we can go, we want to test, select post to add a new pet to the store. We've got some example JSON here. And then very quickly, we can now just hit send. And there we go. We've got a 200 OK and the response back for that. And again, that's the same for all of these endpoints. So from within API Manager, we can actually test the API, which is great, the endpoint API, and that works really well. Now, without doing anything else, if we were to open up something like Postman, we can now call this endpoint here. So this one here, this pet store slash pet, we could do a post to that. We could post this data here. And as long as we provide the subscription key, so again, if we go on the settings of this API, it's looking for a header, which is OCP-API M-subscription key, and the parameter needs to be the subscription key. So if we go in here, we've got a kind of all access subscription key here. So we need to supply that as part of calling that API outside of API Manager. Because we're testing it within API Manager, it kind of pre-puts that in on the header, so we know we've got that. And we can add different subscriptions, so we're not giving the kind of skeleton key, so to speak, which gives access to all APIs. So you would never want to hand this key out externally, because this key would always give you access to all APIs. So you can look at creating subscriptions and different keys and things of that way. That's not what we want to do here. What we want to be able to do here is we want to add a policy, a general policy here to all inbound requests in order to request a token. So what we want to do now is we're going to step out of API Management Service and look at Entra ID, so what was formerly known as Azure AD, and have a look at adding the details and things we need on there in order to be able to set up OAuth within this pet store API. So let's look at doing that now. So what we need to do now is we need to jump out of home, or go to home, and then we need to go to Entra ID, Microsoft Entra ID, there we go. And from within here, we can then look at registering our apps. So what we have to do here is we need to register two applications. So the first one is going to represent the actual backend API. So what we can do is from here we go app registrations. We want to do a new registration, and here is where we're going to register our backend API. So API hyphen, let's call this pet store. If I can spell. Leave everything else default, and then we're just going to hit register. Then we need to go and expose this API. So let's do that. So we go to expose the API. We then need to add an application ID URI. So we're going to hit add here. Gives us a default generated application ID. We can then hit save. And there we go. Then we've got that. So what we want to do is we want to take a copy of that. And this is the API ID. And I'm just storing this on another screen just so we've got it there ready. Then we need to go to app roles. So we've got app roles down here. And then we need to look at creating roles for this particular API. Now we might want to create multiple roles. In this case, I'm just going to create one, and I'm going to call it read write, because we're going to literally allow all of those actions, the posts, the gets, etc. So that's application here, and here we can just call this read write, and then hit apply. So we now have the application ready that represents the backend API. Now we need to register the second application, and this is going to represent the client. So to do that, we go back to app registrations because we're still within the pet store. We then go new registration, and again, this hasn't refreshed. So if I hit refresh, I know if we've gone all applications, we can see we've got the pet store. Then go new, and here we're going to go API hyphen user. And again, we'll keep everything else standard on here. There we go. So we've now registered our API user there. Now from here, what we need to do is we need to go to the API permissions. So if we go API permissions, what we want to do now is we've got our API user. We want to add permissions to our backend API. So from here, we should be able to see the API pet store, read write, and then we can hit add permissions. Now what we need to do is we need to grant the admin consent on here, so we're going to do that now. So that sets that up. And then that allows this API user access to the API pet store. We then need to add Microsoft Graph in as we're using Azure API, so we need to add that in as well. So if we go on here, we're going to go on here. We then need to go on application permissions, and down here we're looking for user.readAll. So let's look at user's going to be down the bottom, isn't it? Yep. User.readAll and user.readWriteAll. And then we add those permissions, and in the same way we then need to grant admin consent for those. So we now have the API app and we now have the client app registered. We now need to set up a client secret, as the client will use its client ID and secret in order to kind of attain its token. So what we need to do here then is we need to select certificates and secrets. Again, this is under the API user, not the API pet store, which is the resource application. This is around the client. So we do that, we can then hit new secret, and here we need to give it a description. So we're literally just going to call this secret, leave everything the same, and hit add. At this point, it creates us a secret. The secret IDs here and the values here. Now this value will only be visible at this point. So we must copy this secret. So I'm going to note this down. So this is client secret because it's the secret value. Once we come out of this screen, this is no longer accessible. There's no way you can get hold of that, and the only thing you can do is delete and recreate again, and then you would need to give the new value to the end client user that's going to be accessing your backend API from Azure API Management. Now if I go back to overview, we should have, yeah, we've got our API user, and here we've got what is called the application ID, also known in more common terms as the client ID. So this we'll also copy and take a note of, because when they request the secret, request a token, they need to provide the client secret and what is known as the client ID. So we've got both of those elements now together. So now we've set up an app registration for the pet store. We've now set an app registration for the API user. We've now given that user permissions, or we've set up, in essence, the app permissions for the pet store. We've also then set up the client secret. We're now ready to take this to API Management Service and now configure our pet store to use OAuth. So let's jump back to API Manager. So we can go back to our Luke API Manager 1. We then find our API, which is here, and then we can select this and go settings. Design. So on the design side, we've got all operations, so we can set a policy for all operations, or we can set policies that are defined based on each individual operation here. We're going to look at all operations. So from here, what we can do now is we can look at adding a policy. You can click and select a policy here like we're going to do. So we're going to validate JWT. So that's our JWT token, and fill in the details here. Or you can actually interact with the XML and declare that separately using XML. Obviously, either way, it's going to add XML anyway, so we're going to go through the sort of wizard way of doing it. So we've got a header name here, which would be authorization. If you've ever used tokens before, OAuth, you'll know that you have a header of authorization, and then the standard is that the value as part of that HTTP request is bearer space and then your actual token value. So if it fails, we know it's a 401. We're going to keep that as it is because that's unauthorized. If we then have a failure, we're then going to put a message back here. So in this case, we're going to go unauthorized, access token is not valid. We then need to add an audience. So the audience in this instance is the API ID for the API that we registered, which was called API-Pet Store. So it's the API ID of the pet store. So we'll put that in here, ensuring we've got the API and then the slashes on there as well. We then need to look at the claim. So the claim here, you need to give it a name, just because it's a policy claim. So we're going to call this roles. We're then going to say any claim is the match. We're not worried about the separator. And then the value for this is read write. So this is the permission that we set up on the original API. So we got that all then set up. Then what we need to do from here is we need to set up the OpenID URL. So the OpenID URL will be standard for yourself as well as me. The difference here is going to be the tenant ID. So here, I'm just going to grab this, pop this in here. So the OpenID URL is this one here, the Microsoft one. And then what I've done here is I've put in braces or double brace the tenant. So that's because I'm going to set up next a named value with my tenant ID in it. And it just means it's in one place. I can reference it everywhere without having the tenant hard coded. So that's how we're going to do that. We've got audiences here, so that works well on that. If I go to full, what else have we got that we can set up on here? Issuers, that's all looking okay. Issuers. So we also want to add an issuer on here as well. So again, the issuer is a standard URL as well. So with this, we're going to have the sgswindows.net, and again, our tenant's going to be here. So that's that done. I can then look to hit save on that too, and then we can look at proceeding to go further. So now I've hit save. It's then added that policy on here, but it hasn't saved it yet. If you come out of this, this will disappear. You've still got to be able to save this. This is showing you the XML equivalent of what you've just configured, basically. So I'm now going to hit save. And we've got some errors on here, so I just need to have a look at what I've configured potentially incorrectly. It can't find the property. Okay, so what I'm going to do here then is I'm going to copy this a second. I'm going to discard this, and I'm going to go in and add my name value first. So if I go on here and go add tenant, tenant, and then the value for the tenant, which in this case, I'm going to grab from here. So there's my tenant ID. There we go. Just grabbing that from another screen. Then I'm going to hit save. And there we go. So we've got that. So now I can go back. I could go back and configure like we just were doing by going into policies, hitting add a policy and going through here. Or what I can do is go directly into here. And under inbound on base, I can then basically paste the bit that I just copied in, which was all the settings that we set up just a second ago. So let's pop that in here now. And now if I hit save, that should be valid. There we go. So we've got that in here now. That's now configured. So what we've done here is we've now gone through the process of configuring OAuth. We're saying that we want an authorization header. We've configured the error message. We've stated the audience. It needs to say that it's got the audience of the API, which is the pet store API. We've then set up the issuer on here as well as the OpenID config URL. And then we're saying that we want, and this is the important bit, we want to have a token that has the role read write. So if it's got this as an audience and it's got the read write value for the role, then we're going to allow it through. So now from here, we can look at what we need to do in order to test this. What we're going to do first of all is we're going to firstly test like we did earlier using API Manager. So we're going to go test. We're going to test creating a new pet store. So before we had all of this and then we hit send and that was a 200 we got back. We're now getting a 401 unauthorized and the message saying unauthorized access token is not valid. This is expected behavior because we're not passing through a header here as we should with authorization, and then what should be here is bearer space and then our actual token. So in order to do that, we need to be able to obtain a token. So how do we do that? Well, let's open up Postman and I can show you how we would look to do this. So here we can see we've got Postman open at the moment. So what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to pass through certain headers. So firstly, this is the URL in order to request a token from your tenant, in essence, request it from Entra ID. So you've got your logon.microsoft.com, your tenant ID, and then the OAuth v2/token. So all I've done is I've set up some variables within my Azure API Manager piece within Postman in order to store that as a separate setting. So you'll have this endpoint. This tenant ID will be replaced with whatever your tenant ID. You can see mine's there. And these are then the elements you need to supply as in the headers. You need to have a grant type, and the grant type is just client credentials because all you're after is a token. Then the client ID is the client ID of the app client ID that we copied earlier, which was from the app registration of API-user. So we're going to put that in here. We then have our client secret. So this was the secret that we stored earlier. That needs to go in here. Then the final one, the scope. Now the scope needs to be the API that you want to access. So this will be the API that you're getting the key for. So in this case, it is our resource API, our backend API. So this is API-pet store. However, as well as taking the API ID sort of URL, you also need to add /.default. That's something that just needs to be provided as part of the scope for in order to get this. So now we've got this, we can then hit send, and we should hopefully get a token. And there we go. So we've now got our access token here. So if we take this token and then we supply this token as part of our request to API Manager, we should then be able to talk to our pet store backend API. So let's do that now. So we've got authorization here, we've got bearer, and now I can paste in my token. And now let's hit send. And there we go, we've got a 200 OK. So that has now worked. So we know now that we need to request a token, and then we're able to submit to our API Manager in order to basically retrieve or post data. In this case, we're posting data to pet store/pet. We're posting the JSON above this here, so we're creating this pet store, and we're able to pass that bearer token. And just to show this is definitely 100% working, I'm going to put 123 in here and then hit send, and we should get a 401 because that's an invalid token. And there you go. So we've been able to set that up now. And then what we're able to do from here, we can actually use Postman to basically call this API. So let's have a look at doing that now, and then I'll explain to you something else that we'll need to be aware of. So now we're in Postman. What we've got is we've got our endpoint here, as we're aware, pet store/pet. We're doing a post. We then need to set the body, which we've taken from API Manager because we know that that's a valid payload. We then need to set an authorization header up. So we need to do a bearer token here. So we're going to select that. And then we need to set our token value. So here, I'm just pasting our token that we've generated earlier, and we tested in API Manager just a minute ago. And then I'm going to hit send. So if I do that now, we're still getting a 401, but we're getting a different error message. So this is something to be aware of. When you're in API Manager, it is by default setting a subscription key. So this subscription key here is automatically being passed. So what we need to do in order to test this is we need to go to subscriptions here, and we've got to be able to basically take a copy of our subscription key. And then with that, we can then go back to Postman and retest our API. So here I can put the subscription in here now, and if I hit send, we now get the response here. Now, if we don't want to start using the subscription key in order to do this, I'm going to untick this so that we're not passing it. Then what we need to be able to do is we need to find the API, our pet store. We need to go to settings, and we need to untick that a subscription is required. So now we've got OAuth on there. We might not want to have that requirement on here. So now if I hit save, and then we go back to Postman, we should be able to submit without that key being there. So we've got the key currently turned off. We can delete that out, and then we can hit send, and it works. So we've now got this endpoint API purely using our token that we requested by requesting our token from Azure AD or Entra ID here. So what we've done in this particular session is we've covered now the creation of an API management service. We've enabled, as we went through, the policy for validating a JWT token here, and we know that that part has worked. I think something to be quite good at to do is to have a look at the content of the token that we've been submitting so that we can see and check some of these values. So what I'm going to do now is check jwt.io, and I can put my token in there, and it will basically decode it so we can see what is within that token. So let's do that now. So here now we're going to drop in our token. So now we've put the token in, we can see here that we've got our audience, and this is equal to the app that we requesting access from or for. And what's really important here is we can see our roles. So we know that the way we're doing this policy is we're checking for the read-write role for the audience of this particular API. So again, if you're ever having any weird things go on when you're trying to follow this through as a tutorial, grab your token, go to jwt.io, put your token in the encode element, and it will decode that token so you can have a look and see exactly what's happening. And you might find that this role you've set up slightly differently, you might put a typo there, anything like that, and it's not going to match because it's matching this policy that we've configured based on the fact that it's looking for a particular role that we set up and a particular audience. So hopefully this has been a very good and useful tutorial in order to set up a Azure API Management service and also to enable OAuth using Entra ID as the provider. Thank you for joining this session. If you have any questions around the content that has been covered during this session, please feel free to comment on the video. Also, if you have any suggestions for new content, please feel free to reach out and ask. And don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with the latest content. Thank you.